The Dominion of Kethra had been conquering worlds for 12,000 years. Their empire stretched across 6 spiral arms of the galaxy, covering more than 2,000 planets. Every species they found, they crushed. Every civilization they discovered, they harvested. No one had ever stopped them. No one had ever even come close. Admiral Vorsun sat in his command chamber aboard the flagship Eternal Conquest, reviewing the latest reports from his scout ships. His species had evolved on a low-gravity world, giving them thin limbs and large, dark eyes that could see in near total darkness. To most other beings in the galaxy, the Kethra looked fragile. But appearances meant nothing. They had built the most powerful military force the universe had ever known. The report on his screen was routine. Another primitive world had been identified in the outer rim of the galaxy. A small blue planet orbiting an average yellow star. The inhabitants called themselves humans. They had recently developed nuclear weapons and were taking their first steps into space. According to Dominion protocols, this made them a potential threat. Not now, but in a few thousand years, they might become competitors. The solution was simple. Harvest them before they could grow. Vorsun barely glanced at the details. He had seen this report 1,000 times before, just with different names and different planets. Primitive species were all the same. They thought they were special. They thought they were alone in the universe. They were wrong on both counts. He assigned a standard subjugation fleet to the task. 40 warships, carrying enough firepower to reduce any pre-spacefaring civilization to ash. It was more than enough. It was always more than enough. The fleet would arrive at the blue planet in approximately 18 months. By the time they were done, the humans would either be slaves or dust. Vorsun did not particularly care which. On the other side of the galaxy, on that same blue planet, a young woman named Katie Morgan was working the night shift at a radio telescope facility in New Mexico. She was 28 years old, with tired eyes and a coffee cup that never seemed to stay full long enough. She had wanted to be an astronomer since she was a little girl, staring up at the stars from her backyard in Ohio. Now, she spent her nights listening to static from deep space, hoping to hear something that would prove humanity was not alone. Most nights, she heard nothing but noise. The universe was vast and cold and silent. But tonight was different. The signal appeared on her screen just after midnight. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the background radiation. But as Katie adjusted the instruments, it grew stronger. More importantly, it was repeating the same pattern over and over again. This was not natural. This was artificial. Her hands trembled as she recorded the data. She had dreamed of this moment her entire life. First contact. Proof of alien intelligence. She wanted to scream, to cry, to call everyone she knew. But she forced herself to stay calm. She had to be sure. She spent the next 3 hours analyzing the signal. It was definitely coming from outside the solar system, somewhere in the direction of the constellation Orion. The pattern was complex, but consistent, and buried within it, she found something that made her blood run cold. Mathematics, universal constants. And then, slowly, painstakingly, she began to decode words. The signal was not just proof of alien life. It was a message. Katie called her supervisor, Pete Harrison, at 4 a.m. Pete was 53 years old. A veteran of the space program who had grown cynical after decades of searching for something that never appeared. He arrived at the facility an hour later, grumbling about false alarms and overeager students. Then he saw the data, and he stopped grumbling. The message took them another full day to decode completely. It was written in a form of mathematical language, designed to be understood by any species intelligent enough to receive it. When they finally translated it into English, they both wished they had not. The message was a warning from a species called the Velthari. They had lived on a world much like Earth, 63 light-years away. They had developed technology, built cities, created art and music and literature. And then the Dominion had come. The Velthari described what happened next in terrible detail. The warships appearing in their sky. The demands for surrender. the destruction that followed when they refused. Their entire civilization had been wiped out in less than a year. Billions dead. Their planet stripped of resources and left as a lifeless husk. But before the end, a small group of Velthari scientists had managed to send out this warning. A message in a bottle, cast into the cosmic ocean, hoping someone would find it in time. The final section of the message was the worst. It contained coordinates and trajectory data for a fleet of warships heading toward Earth. Based on the Velthari calculations, the fleet would arrive in approximately 18 months. Katie and Pete sat in silence for a long time after they finished reading. The stars outside the window looked the same as they always had. Bright and beautiful and distant. But everything had changed. Humanity was not alone. And something terrible was coming. Pete was the first to speak. His voice was quiet and rough. He asked Katie who else knew about this. She told him no one. Just the two of them. He nodded slowly. Then he picked up the phone and made a call to a number he had never expected to use. A number given to him years ago by a man in a black suit who said it was for emergencies. Real emergencies. The kind that could not wait until morning. The man on the other end of the line listened without interrupting. When Pete finished, there was a long pause. Then the man said 3 words that would change the course of human history. Bring everything. Now. Katie Morgan drove through the desert night toward a future she could not have imagined. Behind her, the radio telescope continued to point toward the stars. Still listening, still waiting. But the listening was over. The waiting was over. Humanity had received its answer. The universe was full of life. And some of that life was coming to kill them. She did not know it yet, but Katie Morgan had just become the most important person on Earth. The woman who heard the warning. The woman who gave humanity a chance. 18 months. That was all the time they had. It would have to be enough. The news spread through the highest levels of government like wildfire. Within 48 hours, every major world leader knew the truth. Within a week, a secret summit was called in Geneva. The most powerful people on Earth gathered in a room underground, far from the eyes of the public, to discuss something that none of them had ever expected to face. General Sam Briggs stood at the front of the room. A tall man with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too many wars. He had served in 3 different conflicts over his 30-year career. He had thought he understood what it meant to face an enemy. He had been wrong. The decoded message played on the screen behind him. The representatives watched in silence as the Velthari described their own destruction. Some of them looked sick. Some of them looked angry. A few looked like they wanted to run out of the room and never come back. When the message ended, General Briggs turned to face the assembled leaders. He told them the facts in simple terms. An alien fleet was heading toward Earth. It would arrive in approximately 17 months. Based on the information in the warning message, this fleet had never been defeated. Every civilization they had targeted had been destroyed. The room erupted into chaos. Delegates shouted at each other in a dozen languages. Some demanded proof. Others demanded immediate action. The Russian representative accused the Americans of fabricating the entire thing. The Chinese delegate called for calm. Nobody listened. It took nearly an hour for order to be restored. When it was, the debates began in earnest. The first proposal came from the British representative. He suggested that humanity should surrender immediately. If the Dominion wanted slaves, perhaps being slaves was better than being dead. Perhaps they could negotiate for favorable terms. General Briggs rejected this idea without hesitation. The warning message was clear. The Dominion did not negotiate. They conquered. Surrender would only make the process easier for them. The second proposal came from a small coalition of smaller nations. They suggested hiding. If humanity shut down all radio transmissions and concealed any signs of technology, perhaps the fleet would pass by without stopping. Perhaps they could simply wait until the danger had passed. This idea was rejected as well. The fleet already knew where Earth was. They already knew humans existed. There was no hiding from what was coming. The third proposal came from 2 people who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room. Dr. Laura Chen was a physicist who had spent her career studying theoretical weapons systems. Colonel Nick Reyes was a military strategist who had written papers about unconventional warfare that most people thought were science fiction. Together, they stood and addressed the assembly. They proposed that humanity should fight. The room fell silent. Fighting an enemy that had never been defeated seemed like madness. But Dr. Chen explained that the warning message contained more than just a description of the Dominion's power. It also contained technical data, scientific information about their ships, their weapons, their weaknesses. The Velthari had studied their conquerors in their final days. They had sent that knowledge along with their warning, hoping that someone else might succeed where they had failed. Colonel Reyes added that humanity had one advantage no other species seemed to possess. When pushed to the brink of extinction, humans did not give up. They fought harder. They worked together. They found solutions that should have been impossible. The debate lasted for 3 more days. In the end, a vote was taken. The result was unanimous. Humanity would fight. The next 16 months were unlike anything in human history. Every scientific resource on the planet was redirected toward a single goal. Every military force began training for a battle none of them could truly imagine. And for the first time ever, the nations of Earth truly united. Russian engineers flew to California to work alongside American physicists. Chinese programmers shared code with European designers. Old enemies became allies overnight. The petty conflicts that had divided humanity for centuries suddenly seemed absurd in the face of extinction. In a hidden facility beneath the Nevada desert, a team of scientists worked around the clock on the most important project in human history. They were led by Danny Vance, a young engineer who had been designing satellites just 6 months earlier. Now, he was trying to build a weapon that could destroy alien warships. The data from the Velthari message had given them a starting point. The Dominion ships were powerful, but not invincible. They relied on shields that could deflect conventional weapons. Lasers, missiles, nuclear warheads. None of these would work. But there was something the Dominion had never encountered: gravity. Danny Vance spent sleepless nights studying the mathematics. The theory suggested that it might be possible to create focused gravitational waves powerful enough to tear matter apart at the molecular level. No shield could stop gravity. It passed through everything. If they could weaponize it, they would have something the Dominion had never faced. The problem was that building such a weapon required technology that did not exist. They would have to invent it from scratch. And they had less than a year to do it. Danny gathered the best minds he could find: physicists, engineers, mathematicians. He pushed them harder than any of them had ever been pushed before. They worked 18-hour days, they slept in their labs, they sacrificed everything for a chance at survival. Meanwhile, the military prepared in its own way. General Briggs oversaw the construction of orbital defense platforms. Old nuclear missiles were repurposed and launched into space. Thousands of soldiers trained for combat in zero gravity, a type of warfare that had never existed before. And in a small office in Washington, a young communications officer named Megan Torres was given a very unusual assignment. She was told to prepare a message for the incoming fleet. Not a surrender, not a plea for mercy, something else entirely. Nobody told her what to write. They simply told her to make the Dominion understand what they were dealing with. To make them afraid. Megan Torres was 26 years old. She had studied psychology, linguistics, and history. She had never expected to use all 3 at once. But as she researched humanity's long and bloody past, she began to see a pattern, a truth about her own species that might just be terrible enough to give an alien empire pause. She started writing. And she did not stop until it was done. The countdown continued. 16 months became 12. 12 became 6. And then, the long-range sensors detected the fleet approaching the outer edge of the solar system. The Dominion was coming. But humanity was ready. Not to surrender. Not to hide. To fight. Admiral Vorsun watched the blue planet grow larger on his view screen. Earth. The humans called it. A small world. Unremarkable in every way. In a few weeks, it would be another conquered territory. Another name on the endless list of Dominion victories. He ordered his communications officer to send the standard pre-conquest broadcast. The message was the same one they had sent to 2,000 worlds before this one. A declaration of Dominion supremacy. A demand for unconditional surrender. A promise that resistance would be met with total destruction. Most species surrendered after hearing it. The ones who did not were quickly made to regret their choice. The transmission was sent across all frequencies. It reached every radio receiver, every television, every communication device on the planet. Humanity heard the voice of their would-be conquerors for the first time, cold, emotionless, absolute in its certainty of victory. In the command center beneath Geneva, the leaders of Earth gathered to watch the transmission. General Briggs stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Dr. Laura Chen gripped the edge of her chair. Colonel Reyes stared at the screen with eyes like stone. When the Dominion message ended, there was a moment of silence. Then General Briggs turned to the young woman standing in the corner of the room. He said 2 words, "Send it." Megan Torres had spent 6 months preparing for this moment. She had studied every war in human history, every massacre, every atrocity, every weapon ever designed for the sole purpose of killing. She had compiled it all into a single transmission, a message designed not for diplomacy, but for terror. She pressed the button, and humanity spoke back. The transmission began with images. The trenches of the First World War, where millions died in mud and poison gas for a few miles of ground. The atomic bomb falling on Hiroshima, erasing an entire city in a single flash of light. The concentration camps, the killing fields. The endless wars that had marked human history from its very beginning. No narration was needed. The images spoke for themselves. A species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of destroying its own kind. Then came the voice. Megan Torres had recorded it herself, speaking slowly and clearly, ensuring that the translation algorithms would capture every word. She began by thanking the Dominion for their message. She acknowledged that their empire was vast and powerful. She admitted that humanity had never faced an enemy like them before. Then her tone changed. She explained that humans had been killing each other since before they had discovered fire. That they had developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet. That they had seriously considered using those weapons on multiple occasions, against their own species. That the only thing that had ever stopped them was the fear of mutual destruction. She explained that humans formed bonds with their enemies. That they felt love and loyalty and rage in equal measure. That they were capable of incredible kindness and unspeakable cruelty, sometimes from the same individual on the same day. She explained that humans had never faced a true alien enemy. An enemy they could hate without reservation. An enemy they could destroy without guilt. For all of human history, their wars had been fought against other humans, against creatures who shared their blood, their history, their world. And then she delivered the message that would change everything. You have identified Earth as your next target. We want you to understand something. We have been waiting for you. Not in fear, in anticipation. You are the enemy we have dreamed of, the enemy we have been preparing for without knowing it, the enemy we can fight with everything we have and everything we are, without a single moment of hesitation. We do not ask for mercy. We do not offer surrender. We are sending this message to inform you of a single simple fact. If you come to Earth, we will destroy you. Not because we have to. Because we want to. Because it is what we have always wanted to do. You are giving us permission to be what we truly are. Come to Earth, please. We insist. The transmission ended with a single image. Every military force on the planet, unified for the first time in human history. Soldiers from every nation, standing together, and every single one of them was smiling. Admiral Vorsun watched the human message in silence. When it ended, he watched it again. And then a third time, his communications officer asked if he should prepare the response. The standard demand for immediate surrender. The standard threat of annihilation. Vorsun did not answer. He was studying the images on the screen. The weapons. The destruction. The casual way the humans had documented their own atrocities, as if they were proud of them. He had conquered over 200 worlds personally. He had seen species beg for mercy. He had seen them fight back with desperate courage. He had seen them try to hide, try to negotiate, try to flee. He had never seen a species smile at the prospect of war. He ordered his fleet to stop, not to retreat, just to stop. He needed time to think, time to analyze what he had just witnessed. His officers looked at each other in confusion. In 12,000 years, no Dominion fleet had ever stopped before a conquest. The procedure was simple: arrive, demand, destroy. There was no protocol for hesitation. But Vorsun was not thinking about protocol. He was thinking about the images of human weapons. Weapons they had built to use against themselves. Weapons that seemed almost wasteful in their destructive power. He was thinking about the tone of the message. Not fear, not defiance. Something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like hunger. And he was thinking about the smiles. Those terrible, eager smiles. For the first time in his long career, Admiral Vorsun felt something he had never experienced before. Something cold in his stomach. Something tight in his chest. He did not have a word for it in his language. His species had never needed one. But humans had a word. They called it fear. The fleet held position at the edge of the solar system. And aboard the flagship Eternal Conquest, Admiral Vorsun began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. The news of the fleet's hesitation spread faster than light itself. The Dominion's communication networks carried the information across thousands of worlds. Within days, every corner of the Empire knew that something unprecedented had happened. A harvest fleet had stopped. For the first time in 12,000 years, a Dominion force had paused before a conquest. Admiral Vorsun requested additional intelligence on the human species. He sent probes into the solar system to gather data. He had his analysts study every piece of information the scouts had collected. And the more he learned, the more concerned he became. The humans were predators. This was not unusual among sentient species. What was unusual was how they had become predators. They were not faster than their prey. They were not stronger. They had no natural weapons, no claws, no fangs. Instead, they had evolved something far more dangerous: endurance, patience, the ability to pursue prey for days without rest, tracking it until it collapsed from exhaustion. The humans called it persistence hunting. They simply followed their targets until death became inevitable. And they hunted in groups. Not small family units like most predator species, but large, organized bands that coordinated their efforts across vast distances. They shared information. They planned together. They divided tasks according to individual strengths. More disturbing still were their social patterns. The humans formed bonds with other species. Animals that should have feared them became their companions. Creatures that could have killed them were somehow convinced to serve them instead. The analysts could not explain how this was possible. It defied every principle of evolutionary biology they understood. But the most troubling discovery was psychological. The humans did not merely accept conflict. They enjoyed it. Their entertainment was filled with simulated violence. Their stories celebrated warriors and conquerors. Their sports were stylized versions of combat. Even their children played games that prepared them for war. This was not normal. Most intelligent species developed past such primitive instincts. They learned to value peace, to seek harmony, to avoid unnecessary conflict. The humans had done the opposite. They had refined their violent nature into an art form. Admiral Vorsun presented his findings to the Dominion High Council. He recommended caution. He suggested that perhaps this conquest should be delayed until they had more information, until they understood what they were dealing with. The council was divided. Some members agreed with Vorsun. They pointed to the human message, to the weapons, to the smiles. They argued that this species was different from anything they had encountered before. Others dismissed these concerns. They reminded the council that the Dominion had never been defeated, that no primitive species, no matter how aggressive, could stand against their technology and their numbers. They called for the fleet to continue its mission. While the council debated, the human message continued to spread. It reached the conquered world of Thessar Prime, where a species called the Varnai had lived under Dominion rule for 3,000 years. They had long ago given up hope of freedom. They had accepted their fate as servants and slaves. But when they heard the human transmission, something changed. A resistance leader named Krill gathered his people in secret. He played them the human message. He showed them the images of human weapons, human wars, human defiance. And he asked them a simple question. If these primitives could stand against the Dominion, why could they not do the same? The uprising on Thessar Prime began 3 days later. It was small at first. A refusal to work. A protest in the streets. But it spread quickly. Within a week, the entire planet was in open rebellion, and Thessar Prime was not alone. On 100 different worlds, conquered species heard the human message and felt something they had not experienced in generations: hope, inspiration, the belief that maybe, just maybe, the Dominion was not invincible after all. The rebellion spread like fire through dry grass. The Dominion was forced to divert ships from the Earth fleet to suppress the uprisings. But every ship they sent away weakened their force, and every rebellion they crushed seemed to inspire 2 more. Admiral Vor's son watched the reports with growing horror. The humans had not fired a single shot. They had not destroyed a single Dominion vessel. All they had done was send a message. And that message was tearing his empire apart. He finally understood what the humans had done. They had not threatened the fleet. They had threatened the entire structure of Dominion power. For 12,000 years, that power had rested on a simple foundation: the belief that resistance was impossible, that the Dominion could not be defeated, that surrender was the only option. The humans had shattered that belief. They had shown the galaxy that it was possible to look at the Dominion and smile, to welcome the fight instead of fearing it. And that idea was more dangerous than any weapon. The High Council convened an emergency session. The debate was fierce, but the conclusion was unavoidable. They could not continue the Earth conquest. They needed every ship they had to maintain control of their existing territory. The rebellions had to be suppressed, or the entire empire would collapse. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Dominion considered retreat. Some council members argued against it. They said that retreating from Earth would only encourage more resistance, that it would prove the humans were right to defy them, that it would make them look weak. Others pointed out that they already looked weak. The fleet had stopped. The message had spread. The damage was done. The only question now was how to minimize the losses. In the end, a decision was reached. The fleet would withdraw from the Earth solar system. Not in defeat, they told themselves. In strategic repositioning, they would deal with the rebellions first, restore order to their empire, and then return to finish what they had started. It was a lie. And everyone knew it. But it was a lie that allowed them to retreat without admitting what had really happened. The Dominion had been defeated. Not by weapons. Not by strength. By an idea. By a message. By a species that had looked at the greatest military power in the galaxy and laughed. On Earth, the news of the fleet's withdrawal was met with disbelief, then celebration. People flooded into the streets, crying and cheering and holding each other. They had done it. They had faced extinction and survived. But in the command center beneath Geneva, the mood was more cautious. General Briggs knew that this was not the end. The Dominion was still out there. They would be back. And next time, they would be prepared. Still, they had won the first battle. Not with weapons, but with words, with psychology, with the terrifying truth about what humans really were. Megan Torres stood at the window, looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there, an alien empire was falling apart because of something she had written. It did not feel real. It probably never would, but it had worked. Against all odds, it had worked. Humanity had bet on itself, and the bet had paid off. 1 year passed. The Dominion fleet had retreated. But the chaos they left behind continued to grow. Rebellions spread across their territory like a disease that could not be cured. Every time they crushed one uprising, 3 more appeared in its place. The empire that had ruled for 12,000 years was crumbling from within. On Earth, humanity had not wasted the time they had been given. The gravitational weapons that Danny Vance and his team had been developing were finally completed. Orbital defense platforms circled the planet, armed and ready. The united military forces of Earth had grown stronger, better trained, better equipped. If the Dominion returned, they would face a very different enemy. But the Dominion did not return with warships. They came with a single diplomatic vessel, flying under a flag of truce. Admiral Vorsun himself was aboard that vessel. The same commander who had been sent to harvest Earth was now coming to negotiate. The irony was not lost on anyone. The humans received him in Geneva, in the same underground chamber where they had first learned of the threat to their world. General Briggs led the delegation. Dr. Laura Chen stood beside him, along with Colonel Nick Reyes and a dozen other military and scientific advisors, and standing quietly in the corner was Megan Torres, the young woman whose message had changed everything. Vorsun entered the chamber slowly. He was smaller than the humans had expected. His thin limbs and large eyes made him look fragile, almost delicate. It was hard to believe that this creature had commanded a fleet capable of destroying planets. He looked around the room at the assembled humans. There was no fear in their eyes, no hatred either. Just calm, steady attention. They were watching him the way a predator watches prey. Evaluating, calculating. He spoke through a translation device, his voice flat and mechanical. He explained that he had come to offer terms. Not conquest, not surrender. Recognition. The Dominion was prepared to acknowledge Earth as a sovereign world, exempt from all harvest protocols. They would establish formal diplomatic relations. They would open trade routes. They would treat humanity as equals, something they had never done with any other species in their entire history. General Briggs listened without expression. When Vorsun finished, the general asked a simple question. What did the Dominion want in return? Vorsun hesitated. This was the part he had been dreading. The part that would reveal just how far his empire had fallen. He explained that the rebellions had become uncontrollable. The Dominion had spent 12,000 years conquering. They had never learned how to do anything else. They did not know how to respond to subjects who no longer feared them. They did not know how to suppress resistance that refused to be suppressed. He had come to ask for help, not military help. The Dominion had more than enough soldiers. What they needed was knowledge, understanding. The humans had inspired these rebellions. Perhaps the humans could also explain how to end them. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Danny Vance, the engineer who had built Earth's most powerful weapons, spoke from the back of the room. He suggested that perhaps the Dominion should try not being tyrants. Vorsun did not understand. He asked for clarification. Danny explained in simple terms. The rebellions would stop when people had no reason to rebel. Freedom, self-determination, basic dignity. These were not complicated concepts. Humans had fought for them throughout their history. They knew what happened when those things were denied, and they knew what happened when they were granted. Vorsun seemed genuinely confused. He asked if Danny was suggesting that the Dominion should simply release their conquered worlds, that they should allow subject species to govern themselves. Katie Morgan, the astronomer who had first detected the warning signal, spoke up. She said that was exactly what they were suggesting. She pointed out that humans had tried the empire thing themselves, many times. It never worked out. Empires always fell eventually. The only question was how much suffering came before the end. The Dominion had a choice. They could spend the next 1,000 years fighting rebellions they could not win. Or they could try something different. Something that might actually lead to lasting peace. Vorsun stood in silence for a long time. Everything the humans were saying went against the fundamental principles of Dominion society. Power was meant to be used. The strong were meant to rule the weak. That was how the universe worked, but the universe had changed. The Dominion had been proven wrong. Their strength had failed them. Their power had not protected them. A single message from a primitive species had done more damage than any army could have done. Perhaps it was time to change. He asked if the humans would be willing to help. Not to fight their battles for them, but to advise, to teach, to share the knowledge they had gained from their own history of conflict and resolution. General Briggs looked at his colleagues. They held a brief, silent conversation. Then he turned back to Vorson and extended his hand. Deal. 10 years later, the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. The Dominion still existed, but it was no longer an empire. It had transformed into a confederation of free worlds, bound together by trade and mutual defense, rather than conquest and fear. Former subject species now sent representatives to a council where decisions were made through negotiation and consensus. Humanity had taken its place among the stars. Not as conquerors, but as something more unexpected. Mediators, advisors, teachers, their unique psychology, their experience with both war and peace, made them invaluable in disputes between species who had never learned to compromise. On the anniversary of the message, a monument was unveiled on the grounds of the United Nations building. It was simple but striking. A single pillar of black stone, polished to a mirror finish. On its surface, words were carved in every human language, and 100 alien ones besides. "Come to Earth, please, we insist." Beneath that famous line, a second inscription had been added at the suggestion of Ambassador Vorson, who now represented the Dominion Confederation in diplomatic matters. They regret it, but not as much as they expected. Megan Torres stood before the monument, surrounded by dignitaries from a dozen worlds. She was no longer a young communications officer. She was the Secretary General of the United Nations, the leader of humanity's voice in galactic affairs. Her message had made her famous. Her work in the years since had made her respected. A reporter asked her what she felt, looking at the monument. Looking at the words she had written 10 years ago, she thought about it for a moment. Then she smiled. She said that when she wrote the message, she had been terrified. She had not known if humanity could actually fight the Dominion. She had not known if the weapons would work, if the unity would hold, if any of their plans would succeed. The message had been a bluff, a desperate gamble by a species facing extinction, but she had believed it while she was writing it. She had believed that humans were capable of everything she described. The violence, the determination, the refusal to surrender, no matter the odds. And in the end, the belief had mattered more than the weapons. The Dominion had not retreated because they feared human technology. They had retreated because they feared human nature, because they had looked at what humanity truly was and decided that some fights were not worth winning. The reporter asked if she had any regrets, if there was anything she would change. Megan Torres looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, thousands of worlds were free because of what had happened here. Billions of beings had been liberated from tyranny, not by force, but by an idea, by the belief that resistance was possible, that even the mightiest empire could fall. She said no regrets, not one. Humanity had done what it always did when facing impossible odds. It had refused to lose. It had bet on itself, on its own stubborn, violent, beautiful nature, and the bet had paid off. The stars above Geneva were bright and peaceful. But Megan Torres knew that peace was never permanent. New challenges would come. New threats would emerge. That was the nature of existence, in any galaxy. But humanity would face those challenges the same way it had faced the Dominion, together, unafraid. And if necessary, smiling. That was what it meant to be human, and the galaxy was finally beginning to understand.